The exact year that Princess Olga of Kiev was born is disputed. The Primary Chronicle states her birth year was 879, while other sources claim she was born in 890 or maybe even a little later. Given that we know her only son was born in 942, the earlier date can be safely ruled out, and even the latter one is questionable. There is also no solid evidence as to her place of birth, with sources placing her in Pskov or Veshchy. What is known about Olga is that sometime before 912 she married Prince Igor, the son of the founder of the Rurik dynasty of Russian Tsars. In 912 the pair took to the throne of the Kievan Rus. As previously mentioned, the pair had a son named Sviatoslav around 30 years later in 942, presumably implying she was extremely young when they were wed. Whatever the case, 3 years after the birth of his son, Igor traveled to meet the Drevlians. They were a Slavic tribe who owed him tribute. When Igor demanded more than the Drevlians thought his rule was worth, instead of paying him, they simply killed him. Igor and Olga must have had a pretty happy marriage, because she did not take his death very well. Her 3-year-old son was next in line to the throne, which meant that as his mother, she became regent until he was old enough to rule by himself. While having a woman in charge of the government wasn't exactly the norm, she had the full support of the Rus army to back her regency. However, the Drevlians weren't so keen on a female leader. They decided to send ambassadors to negotiate a marriage between Olga and Prince Mal, their top choice for king. According to the Primary Chronicles, originally compiled in 1113 in Kiev, Princess Olga listened to their proposal and then stated, "Your proposal is pleasing to me indeed. My husband cannot rise again from the dead, but I desire to honor you tomorrow in the presence of my people. Return now to your boat and remain there with an aspect of arrogance. I shall send for you on the morrow, and you shall say, 'We will not ride on horses nor go on foot. Carry us in our boat,' and you shall be carried in your boat." Next it states, "Now Olga gave commands that a large deep ditch should be dug in the castle with the hall outside the city. Thus on the morrow, Olga, as she sat in the hall, sent for the strangers, and her messengers approached them and said, 'Olga summons you to great honor.' But they replied, 'We will not ride on horseback, nor in wagons, nor go on foot. Carry us in our boats.' So they carried the Drevlians in their boat. The latter sat on crossbenches in great robes puffed up with pride. Thus they were borne into the court before Olga, and when the men had brought the Drevlians in, they dropped them into the trench along with their boat. Olga bent over and inquired whether they found the honor to their taste. They answered that it was worse than the death of Igor. She then commanded that they should be buried alive, and they were thus buried. Not exactly living up to Leviticus chapter 19 verse 18, though to be fair, she hadn't converted yet, where it states, "Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge, love your neighbor as yourself." She would soon double down on this. First, she insisted that the Drevlians send her their distinguished men so that she might go to their prince with due honor, which they agreed to do, not knowing that she had already had the last batch murdered. When the second group came, she had baths drawn from them. Then, when they were in, she had the doors locked and the building set on fire. Next up, she requested to be allowed to mourn her husband, and the Drevlians agreed, inviting her over. She then came, and supposedly, after everyone was properly drunk, had 5,000 men killed after a feast held in her honor. Given her attitude over the ordeal, it seems reasonable enough to think that there is a grain of truth to this story, though it's thought likely that the number of deaths was grossly over-exaggerated in the chronicles, especially as at this point she didn't bring her army with her. Speaking of her army, as a last act of revenge, she besieged a Drevlian city. After a very lengthy siege, they asked to parley and offered various goods in exchange for their transgression, but were concerned if they surrendered, she might take further revenge on them. She assured them that she was over the death of her husband, and instead simply asked for a final act of penance, and that was that they give her hundreds of sparrows and pigeons from the city. The Drevlians agreed. However, according to the Primary Chronicles, she then used a strategy that about 1,000 years later the US military strongly considered using against Japan during World War II, but with bats in the latter case, and we're going to discuss that in the bonus facts in a bit. Namely, this was that she would release the animals near the city with means to set the place ablaze after they'd roosted for the night. So, well, how did this turn out for Olga? Now Olga gave to each soldier in her army a pigeon or a sparrow and ordered them to attach by thread to each pigeon and sparrow a piece of sulfur bound with small pieces of cloth. When night fell, Olga bade her soldiers release the pigeons and the sparrows. So the birds flew to their nests, the pigeons to the cotes, and the sparrows under the eaves. The dovecotes, the coops, the porches, and the haymows were set on fire. There was not a house that was not consumed, and it was impossible to extinguish the flames because all the houses caught on fire at once. The people fled from the city, and Olga ordered her soldiers to catch them. Thus she took the city and burned it and captured the elders of the city. Some of the other captives she killed, while some she gave to others as slaves to her followers. The remnant she left to pay tribute. Hell hath no fury and all that. From all of this, it might surprise you that this vengeful woman was made a saint in Roman Catholicism and Russian Orthodoxy. As to why, before she came into power, Kievan Rus was a pagan society, but Olga changed all of that by eventually converting to Christianity. She was baptized sometime around the 950s. Her son did not approve of his mother's conversion. He believed that Christianity wasn't a very tough religion, and by switching, she would lose the respect of the military who had stood by her even after her husband's death. Indeed, when Sviatoslav was eventually old enough to take control of his realm, he mostly focused on trying to improve the military and was more or less uninvolved in other aspects of running the country. While he was off on military campaigns, he left his son, Vladimir the Great, home with Olga to raise him and otherwise run his little empire. Despite her son's objections, Olga continued on trying to spread Christianity and went so far as to request archbishops and priests appointed to her country. But because her son, a pagan, was technically in charge at the time, the Holy Roman Emperor was hesitant. Not helping matters, one archbishop also claimed that it was impossible to convert the people of Kievan Rus. When he tried, he was expelled by Sviatoslav's allies and his fellow travelers were killed. The church thus clearly thought they would be sending their priests to their deaths. However, it's entirely possible that Olga's intentions were pure. Her side of that particular story, it was never told. To lend credence to her innocent intentions, before she died in 969, Olga secretly kept a Catholic priest near her at all times. Her son disapproved of her Christian ways, but with the priest she was able to get her last rites, and her son did allow a Christian burial rather than the pagan celebration. Things changed markedly on that front in the nation after Sviatoslav's reign, when his son Vladimir, no doubt thanks to the influence of his grandmother before her death, made Christianity the official religion of the nation in the 980s. Despite her previous bloody revenge on the Drevlians, Olga was made a saint in 1547 because of her efforts to create a Christian nation and her subsequent success via converting her grandson. And now for a bonus fact. Bat bombs were an experimental weapon considered by the US during World War II at the suggestion of dentist Dr. Lytle Adams, who was a friend of the First Lady. These bombs consisted of a bomb-shaped casing with several compartments inside. Each bat had a small incendiary device attached to it. The casings were refrigerated in order to lower the bat's body temperature and force them into hibernation until they were dropped from a plane shortly before dawn. A parachute would slow the descent, and eventually the casing would be triggered to open and release the bats. As bats in sunlight would seek roosts in dark places like attics, when they were released and the sun came out, they'd seek such places. The hope was that with the incendiaries timed to go off all at once, this would start fires in places that were hard to access to fight the fire. Further, in many cases, the fire's existence would have been noticed until it had well established itself. It was also thought that bat bombs would be particularly effective in Japan, where buildings were largely made of wood and paper. Release several 100,000 of these bats in major Japanese cities, and the towns would go up in flames, while resulting in much smaller losses of life than by carpet bombing or later nuclear strike. Essentially, it would help take out the infrastructure while minimizing civilian casualties, so sort of a win-win. While on the surface the plan may seem far-fetched, the US agreed to develop the bat bomb for 4 reasons. Bats are available in large numbers. 4 caves in New Mexico alone are each believed to be the home to millions of bats. Bats can carry more weight than their own weight in flight, up to 3 times their weight in fact. Bats can hibernate for extended periods without the need for food or water. And finally, bats fly in the dark, then find secluded places to hide at sunrise. The program was actually mildly successful in a bad way. During testing, some of the bats with incendiary devices attached escaped, resulting in a large part of the base where they were being tested, Carlsbad Army Airfield Auxiliary Air Base, burning down. The results in the controlled testing were also extremely promising, and it seemed like this idea would actually work. In fact, it was estimated that while standard incendiary bombs would probably start about 167 to 400 fires per bomb load in a major Japanese city, based on the testing, the bat bombs would probably produce about 3,625 to 4,748 fires per load. Further, just 10 B-24 bombers could carry an astounding 1,040,000 bats strapped with the 17 to 28 gram incendiary devices. However, the program was cancelled not because it didn't work, but for other reasons. In this case, it was estimated that the bats would not be ready for deployment until mid-1945. Despite the promising results in testing, the program was considered to be moving too slowly, and with an estimated $2 million invested in it, about $25.7 million today, too expensively. Instead, the Manhattan Project was deemed a more likely candidate for ending the war sooner, as it was thought to be progressing quicker and certainly would have a more dramatic effect if it was ultimately successful. Both for the historical novelty of ending World War II with literal bat bombs and for avoiding having to use a nuclear weapon in war and the massive loss of life that ensued, I think we can all, except for maybe the bats, agree that it's too bad the timetable on the bat bomb project was considered just a bit too long. For reference, Little Boy and Fat Man were deployed on August the 6th and 9th of 1945 respectively. So, at the original timetable, the bats would have been ready sooner and for cheaper had the project continued to be funded. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, smash that like button below. Also, please do check out another channel I do called Geographics. It's a geography-based channel. If you enjoyed this video, I think you'll enjoy that as well. It's linked to below. And as always, thank you for watching.